I'm going to show you guys how to make one of my favorite cakes from my childhood. It ticks so many boxes. It's cheap, it uses only pantry staples, it's really easy to make, and it tastes good. I'm talking about wacky cake. Everything you see here is the only ingredients of this wacky cake. That's partly why it's called wacky. It's really untraditional for a cake. There's no butter, there's no milk, there's no eggs. Surprise, it's vegan because of that, but don't let that deter you. I promise it tastes really good. So let's go through the ingredients. Salt, everybody has that. Flour. I know this is actually kind of hard to find nowadays, but do your best. There are alternatives. You can use all-purpose flour is what you're supposed to use. You can use bread flour. Your cake will be a little tough. If you have cornstarch or any like gluten-free flour, you could substitute some of your bread flour out with that flour to lighten it up a little bit. You could use like all gluten-free flour if that's all you have, or if you're gluten-free. It's just like your cake will be very, very crumbly if you do that. But you know, you can still do that in a pinch. Cocoa powder, vanilla extract, white granulated sugar, baking soda. Everybody should have this in their house anyway. Like even if you're not a baker, you probably have some in your fridge to keep it fresh or to clean. And same thing goes for cider vinegar. I've made this with like different vinegars before, like raspberry vinegar. This is actually white vinegar that's apple cider flavored. I didn't notice that until I got it home and I was kind of upset about that, but it still works. You just need a little vinegar because that's going to react with your baking soda to lift our cake. And oil, just plain old corn or vegetable oil, any kind of oil that doesn't have any flavor to it. And for equipment, this is all you need. Just a 8x8 or 9x9 inch square pan. I happen to have glass. Metal's actually better, but you know, glass is what I have, so I'm using it. A bowl, like a medium to large size bowl. I'm using a good old Tupperware bowl. It really doesn't matter what kind of bowl it is because you're not using a KitchenAid or stand mixer or electric mixers or any fancy tools. You can just use a big spoon. I'm using just a spatula. Because this doesn't have eggs or butter that need to be creamed, like you actually don't want to stir this cake very much. So start by preheating your oven to 350. Usually when you bake a cake, you need to prep the pan with parchment and or butter and flour so the cake doesn't stick. This cake doesn't exactly really stick. You can, like I've actually heard of people just mixing the batter right in the cake pan and that's it. I prefer a bowl because it gives you a little more room, but I'm gonna add just like a little bit of oil and spread it around with my impeccably clean fingers just for insurance, but like you really don't have to. We're gonna leave the cake in the pan after it's baked. It's one of those kinds of simple, lazy cakes. Ta-da! But we're gonna use the muffin method to mix this cake. That's just a fancy way of saying we're gonna put in all the dry ingredients first and then the wet and just mix them together. So 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour. I was using that bag earlier just for visual appeal because it looks nicer, but that was my bread flour. This is my all-purpose flour, and as you can probably see, I barely have any of it left. I think I have like just enough for this cake and maybe a little bit more for something else. Yeah, it looks like I have maybe a half to a cup of flour left. And a cup of sugar. I'm using a 1/2 cup measuring cup for all of this because my cup measuring cups are currently drying in the dishwasher. Have a cup measuring cup, totally use that. And then 1/4 teaspoon of salt. I'm just going to kind of eyeball it. This is a teaspoon of baking soda. And then this wasn't in the original recipe, but for insurance, I like to add just a little bit of baking powder, just like a 1/2 teaspoon. A couple times that I've made this cake a lot, but a couple times that I made it, it kind of sank in the middle and didn't rise really super well. So I like to add just a little bit of baking powder for insurance. Then our last ingredient is 3 tablespoons of cocoa powder. It's actually not a lot of cocoa powder, but the cake does wind up tasting pretty chocolatey. Again, I didn't show this in the original shot because it looks weird visually, but this is like a leftover tablespoon or so of regular cocoa powder that I got at the bulk section of Winco. I'm just gonna polish that off. And then the rest of this is actually Dutched processed cocoa. I've never made this actually with Dutched before. I'm actually a little nervous that it will mess with the rising component of this cake because they do process it, I think, with like an alkaline solution, which is another reason why I'm using a little baking powder in my cake, but we'll find out together. So now that you have all your dry ingredients, just give them a quick mix together. Nothing fancy. This is such an easy recipe that even a kid could make it. You could sift this if you really wanted to, but you really don't have to. Just mix this very thoroughly when it's dry. Like, make sure that the color is homogeneous and there aren't any like lumps of cocoa powder or baking soda or anything. Now I heard, I should have done my research before I pressed record, but I heard that this cake was invented like during the Great Depression, like during World War II, kind of around that time, which would make sense. It was when people were rationing their food and they didn't have a lot of fresh ingredients, but people still wanted to make cakes, you know, wanted to make birthday cakes or, you know, some kind of comfort food, I guess, and they wanted to still make cakes. So this recipe was invented. Oh, also incidentally, you can make this cake, like if you don't have cocoa powder, you can leave it out. I've actually done that before. I don't particularly like it that much, like it's not a very good vanilla cake. But if you do, leave out the cocoa powder, either by choice or because you don't have it. I would add like extra vanilla. I probably like put 3 times as much vanilla in the cake as the original recipe calls for. And of course you could play with other flavors too. You could put like extracts in your cake. Almond extract if you actually like that stuff. I think it tastes like medicine. All right, that's pretty homogenized, so we're gonna leave like a hole, like a little well in there, and be on standby for our wet ingredients. So for our wet ingredients, I like to measure everything just in a Pyrex 2-cup measuring cup, because it's just, you can measure it all in one thing, and then you only have to wash one thing afterwards. And you can see how much everything is as you measure it. So you need half a cup of oil, and oil actually works better for certain cakes. It makes your cake moister than butter does, because oil, as you can see at room temperature, it's liquid. Whereas butter kind of gets solidified, so it can make your cakes tougher, but oil makes them nice and moist. So half a cup of vegetable oil. Then I need a cup of water, so I'm going to fill it to the 1.5 cup mark. Then you need just 2 teaspoons of the vinegar. The vinegar does 2 things. One, it actually kind of amplifies the chocolate flavor, kind of like, you know, if you like those chocolate oranges at Christmas, it's that acid in the orange that makes it like taste more chocolatey. And the other thing the vinegar does is it helps the baking soda activate, which will give our cake its lift. And then you need about a teaspoon of vanilla extract. I just eyeball it. If you don't have vanilla extract, it's not the end of the world. Maybe if you have some instant coffee, you can add that. I'm just gonna give it a slight stir with a spoon and then pour it into our well. And as with any cake, you don't want to overmix this because it'll activate the gluten in the flour and give you a tough cake. But this cake is actually a little more forgiving. The batter is very watery compared to some other cakes. It should kind of remind you, if you've made cake from cake mix before, it should kind of remind you of that in consistency. The only real difference is there's no eggs in here. I mean, if you want to add eggs, you could. But if you did, like, I'd reduce the water, obviously. And then it wouldn't be a wacky cake anymore, so don't add eggs. Embrace the weirdness. As you can see, there's some bubbles forming. That's the baking soda already starting to react with the vinegar. It's a good sign. So you don't want to let this sit around for too long, otherwise your reaction's gonna like go to waste. So see, came together pretty quickly, and we're just gonna put it in the pan and now bake it for 30 to 40 minutes. And into 350-degree oven for 30 to 40 minutes or until it's done. So I have been keeping this cake overnight. You want it to cool off completely before you frost it, and I made the cake in the evening, so I just cooled it overnight, but it doesn't have to be overnight. It could just be like 2 to 3 hours on a wire rack, and I just leave it in the pan. Most cakes you are supposed to take out of the pan. This cake you don't really, you just sort of leave it in the pan. Great to do that actually, because if you're taking this to a party or a potluck, you know, it's easy to transport it. But anyway, I just loosely covered it with a plastic bag just so it wouldn't get too dried out at the top, but it's a pretty moist cake, so you don't have to worry too much about that. Anyway, it's time to frost it. So Joshua and I really like vanilla frosting with chocolate cake, so that's the kind of frosting I'm making, and I'm doing a lazy American buttercream. There are other options for frostings, which I'll go over a little bit, and in the video description I'm going to have a lot of different frosting alternatives, especially if you don't have some of these ingredients or if you want something different. But anyway, the frosting is also mostly Pantry Staples. So we have powdered sugar, vanilla extract. I actually like canned milk. Usually you'd use milk or even cream, but I actually really like canned milk in my frosting. I think it adds a good richness, concentrated milk flavor. And butter. This is like 1 stick minus 1 tablespoon of butter. I'd use the tablespoon for something else. But anyway, you want it to soften the butter. And I like to microwave it on low for about, 30 seconds or so to a minute until it is soft. But don't worry, like if that's too complicated for you, just melt the butter. I used to do that all the time when I was a kid. So anyway, I'm gonna go soften the butter. All right, it even got a little bit melted, but that's totally okay, like I said. And, ordinarily I'd use, mixers, electric mixers to really fluff up the butter, but this is an easy, lazy cake. So I'm using a fork, a mighty fork. And first I'm just gonna mash up the butter a little bit. Really hard to do with one hand holding a camera. Oh, husband. Yay, I got a cameraman. Anyway, if you're using melted butter, it's already ready to go, but you just want to make it so that it hasn't got any big lumps in there. It'll sort itself out in a minute. So, confession time. I don't measure things, but I'm gonna do it today for the sake of you guys. So that's a stick of butter minus a tablespoon. This is 1/3 cup of powdered sugar. I pretty much just add it until it reaches the right consistency. And it's gonna look all dry at first, but then it will incorporate. So for other options of frosting, you don't have to use butter, of course. If you want to keep this cake vegan, you can use margarine, and that's more shelf stable anyway. You could even use coconut oil. And you could use peanut butter also to make a peanut butter frosting. Here's another 1/3 cup of powdered sugar. If you don't have like powdered sugar and other things, but maybe you have chocolate chips, you could melt the chocolate chips and just pour melted chocolate over the cake. That works. Or if you're fancier and if you have canned milk or cream, you could melt equal parts chocolate and cream in the microwave and then cool it and whip it a little bit, and it makes a nice dark chocolate frosting. You could add a little cocoa powder to this frosting and turn it into chocolate frosting. You could put like different extracts in here other than vanilla, which by the way, I'm gonna add now. And again, I don't measure this. I just splash it in, but that was probably about a 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla extract. And some of it just splashed out of the bowl, yay. All right, another 1/3 cup of powdered sugar. So this is about a cup of powdered sugar total now. And sometimes I don't even wind up adding any milk at all. Right, and if you wanted to keep the frosting totally vegan, you could of course use coconut milk or some other, I'd use coconut milk just because it's nice and thick instead of cow's cream or milk or canned milk. And the milk is really only there, like sometimes I use it, sometimes I don't. It's really there just to thin it out if it needs thinning. One more 1/3 cup of powdered sugar. So I've added the 4th 1/3 cup of powdered sugar to this frosting. I haven't added any milk at all. I might not add any. It looks like it's a pretty good consistency, and at this point I'm just gonna taste it. It's very sweet. That's a lazy American buttercream for you. If you want to be fancy, there's like French buttercreams, Italian, Swiss buttercreams that use eggs and such, but this isn't really a fancy cake. I used to eat this stuff with a spoon when I was a kid too. Good. So the consistency is pretty good now, and I have a good amount of it. I don't really want to make it much sweeter. Like if you don't mind your frosting being sweeter, you can totally keep on adding powdered sugar and then probably add milk or cream in turn. I'm gonna add more vanilla though. My human tripod started feeling faint and had to sit down, so that's why I'm stirring it all weird. So this is, again, if you want to take your frosting up to, whoa, I'm trying to find a good angle. If you want to take your frosting up to the next level, it's good to aerate it, and you can do that with just a fork. Just kind of beat it really, really quickly, like this, and you'll aerate the butter and make your frosting a little lighter and fluffier. You don't have to do this, of course, but it's nice if you do. Frosting is nicely aerated and it tastes really good, and I'm ready to frost the cake. So if I were being fancy, I'd use, piping bags and offset spatulas, but I'm not being fancy, so I'm just gonna use a spatula. If you wanted to, of course, you could add some food coloring to the frosting. What I like to do is dump all of the frosting into the center of the cake first. Don't attempt to start spreading it, because if you attempt to start spreading it too early, you're just going to pick up crumbs of the cake, and then you're gonna have very crummy frosting. Don't worry about actually crumb coating this cake though, if you've heard of crumb coating. Again, this is a very lazy, easy cake. So all of the frosting is now in the center of the cake, and I basically press into the center of the cake and just spread the frosting outwards from the center of the cake. That way you're a lot less likely to get some crumbs. You might still get some crumbs, but that's okay. But if you're slow and patient, you should be okay. Try not to press too hard, because that will be another factor that will get you crumbs in your frosting. It's a little pesky corner. And behold, it's chocolatey, pantry-full goodness. It's breakfast, but I'm gonna have cake because I'm an adult. That reminds me so much of my childhood. Anyway, it's cheap, easy, and uses Pantry Staples, and it's tasty, so I hope you all make it. Stay safe and happy.